Welcome everyone to the student lecture series. We're very excited to have Anooradha Siddiqi with us today. So she is an assistant professor of architecture at Barnard College, Columbia University, and co-editor of Feminist Architectural Histories of Migration, which was published in 2020, and Spatial Violence, published in 2016. Her book, Manuscript Architecture of Migration, the Dadaab refugee camps and humanitarian settlement analyzes the history, visual rhetoric, and spatial politics of the Dadaab refugee camps in northeastern Kenya. It moves beyond the historical representation of camps and their inhabitants to find long migratory and colonial traditions in the architecture and iconography of refugees and humanitarians, particularly those engaged in homemaking. Her book manuscript, Minette de Silva and the Modern Architecture of the Past, engages the intellectual and heritage work of a singular figure in the history of Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and one of the first women in the world to establish a professional architecture practice, responsible for house and housing designs in the new nation, and thinking and teaching on domesticity during the Civil War. We would also like to thank Elisa Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown for their continual support. And if you're ready, I'll hand it off to you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for everyone for being here with us on this very weird week. We really appreciate it.
Are you handing it to me or to someone else?
Oh, to you. It's all you now.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. It's really, really very nice to be here. And good evening to you all. It's it's always a privilege to be invited to speak to Cooper Union students. And I think, as I told Martina, when I heard from her in September, I was crushed by homeschooling kids and just getting the semester started. And I was just saying no to everything on earth. But when an invitation comes from students from the Cooper Union, I can never say no. So I'm really thrilled to be here, but I will also say that when the invitation came, I was so crushed by things that I didn't actually pay attention to the date. And so it is pretty bizarre to be here this week. And I think I'm feeling even more grateful to be here during this week with all of you. I had the honor of teaching and learning with Cooper Union students a couple of years ago in a course that I co-taught with Mario Gooden, Samia Heni, and Mpo Matsipa. And I think it was, frankly, life-changing for me to be with such earnest learners. And so I really mean it when I say that it means a lot to me to be able to sit with you during this week. So it's also a luxury to have this opportunity to talk with you about a project that is a theoretical project, and it's also the beginning of a scholarly and intellectual process with a new working group. So I will also thank you for enabling a kind of expansiveness today that will help me and hopefully help you too to clarify some theoretical groundwork. And during our time together today, I'm going to try to articulate a conceptualization of insurgent domesticities as it looks at the beginning of this project, and also to think through the methods and politics of a feminist scholarship that addresses critical and core issues in the study of the built environment, territory, and spatial and aesthetic practice. Naturally, we're all filled with certain thoughts and emotions related to the events of these past months, the drama of this week. But my hope is that through a discussion of insurgent domesticities, we can begin to address some of these problems that are surging around us. Insurgent Domesticities is the name of a working group that I'm organizing through the Center of the Study of Social Difference at Columbia University. It grew out of a collaboration that was begun in 2017 by Lillian Chi at the National University of Singapore in a symposium in the architecture school titled Situating Domesticities in Architecture. And if you're interested, I encourage you to look up that website, Situating Domesticities. You can read the abstracts from that project. From that, a small transnational, transcontinental collaboration emerged between Lillian Chi and myself, Barbara Penner at the Bartlett at the UCL, and Naomi Stead from Monash University, who I believe will be speaking to you next week. So you should try to check out her talk. And later we were also joined by Sophie Hochhausel at Penn. In radically different ways, each of us were studying domesticities in our work as architectural historians, but very differently from the ways that this term, I think, has often appeared in architectural histories when it does appear. So I encourage you to visit the Columbia University Center for the Study of Social Difference website. For Insurgent Domesticities, you can see a project description that grew out of this initial collaboration. And that website will also host the work of the larger group that is launching in the spring of 2021. And we will begin to articulate and theorize insurgent domesticities in a range of areas, subjects, disciplines, and fields. Before that, I would like to acknowledge each member of this working group, and if it's all right, I'll just list them all by name. Lillian Chi, M. Constantine, Annapurna Garimella, Abuseri George, Gil Hochberg, Sophie Hochhausel, Mignon Moore, Lydia Mutuma, Garnet Oluoch Olunya, Barbara Penner, Akira Drake Rodriguez, Felicity Scott, Kavita Sivaram Krishnan, Naomi Stead, Rhiannon Stevens, Neferti Tadiar, Madiha Tahir, Miriam Tickton, Delia Wendell, Jennifer Wenzel, Melanie Yazi, and Sarovar Zaidi. They work in and on all corners of the world in various institutional settings in Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, North America, and South America. The working group has not officially launched, and while some of the members have interacted with each other and we have had small group meetings, the full group has not yet convened. Oh, I'm realizing that I've forgotten our graduate coordinator. Her name is Ife Vanable, and you know her very well as one of your professors, but I somehow left her name off this list. So even though the group hasn't yet convened, it was important to me to speak with you about this work at this juncture, in part in order to discuss the mechanics of a collaborative process, and also to discuss goals for a feminist practice of collaboration. I don't believe the methods of a collaborative praxis need to be fully worked out before one begins to theorize them. And certainly the very nature of collaboration suggests dynamism and contingency. And I suppose I'm saying this to you as a group of spatial and aesthetic practitioners. But I believe that articulating a praxis, even at the outset, in a discursive and dialogical context like this one, can help to fix a firmament for a collaborative orientation and also for a critical community. So I would like to use our discussion today in order to lay out insurgent domesticities on the one hand as a theoretical concept, and on the other as a feminist historiographical and scholarly politics. These ideas were conceived in discussions between members of this group long before a pandemic that has thrown the work of all into the framework of insurgent domesticities. Yet the job of this group is to find precision around this problematic and to find meaning, and to use our intersections as leverage for a multi-pronged endeavor and perhaps someday a collective one. In the work of each member of this group, we've come to know the problematic conditions of the domestic, of domesticity. As a term, domesticity has been neutralized. It's been defanged, emasculated, while it has also actively produced epistemic scaffolds for oppression. It has been coded white, bourgeois, Victorian, and heteronormative, while racinating, ethnicizing, queering, gendering, and infantilizing. It suggests a benign security and stability around putatively protective or sheltering architectures, which may not indeed demonstrate such qualities. In other words, domesticity is a term that slips through the cracks, especially in a history and theory that seeks formal or discursive objects with which to narrate power, or an epistemology that seeks known and well-traveled pathways to reproduce those narrations. As Lillian Chi has observed, domesticity is a term that lives in the footnotes. As she suggested, it has a subversive power as it becomes emergent. To think with domesticity about the dwelling, the built environment, the landscape, or the state, to name things at various scales that have been accompanied by a figuration of an interior or forwarded a conception or an imaginary of the domestic, is to think about architecture using insurgent methods. Insurgent because the framework of domesticity can enable a potent interrogation veiled in terms that might appear more compromising. This framework calls into question monolithic concepts of home, homemaking, housing, homeland, as well as the boundaries they form, the architectures and territories they construct, or the bodies they efface or subjugate. As we write in the project description, home has been used as a boundary-forming device to identify, homogenize, normalize, and exclude. Composed of family and nation and attendant notions of their sanctity, home is no longer open to reinterpretation and reconfiguration. It is pressured as a lived space. Part of the work the individuals in this group have undertaken, and what we may perhaps do jointly over time, is to develop histories and other specific studies of insurgent environments, objects, and practices that make up the maintenance, creation, labor, and intimacies of home. This work demands an investigation of domesticity through processual aspects rather than through representations or results. This work also interrogates the politics of home. It does this through histories of solidarity, disobedience, stealth, and militancy, which may be unexpected or embedded within more evident narratives. This work also examines home and domesticity through many scales at once, from that of the clothesline to that of the state. So, let me present one historical context which we can use to imagine a theory of insurgent domesticities that straddles these scales, that's rooted in forms of solidarity, disobedience, stealth, and militancy, and that is more than it appears to be. So for that, I would like to share my screen, which I hope works. This photograph that you see on the screen was taken in 2011 in a built environment that has by now disappeared. It's from one of the many settlements in the massive UNHCR refugee camp complex in Dadaab, Kenya. The settlement was called Ifo 2. The settlement still exists, but not in the form you see here. It was planned and established as an extension of Ifo, the first refugee camp the Kenyan government and the UNHCR had established at Dadaab after the breakdown of the state and civil social systems in Somalia in 1991. As armed conflict and environmental and food insecurity took hold, thousands of people were displaced and many fled to towns in the neighboring country to the west, Kenya. The government of Kenya offered asylum to some of these people, but also confined them to specific zones. This was done through intensive policing, particularly around Dadaab. This strategy resulted in significant contracts between the UNHCR and the Kenyan police force. In the time since its establishment in 1991, the refugee settlement complex has institutionalized on many levels, becoming the largest ever hosting establishment for refugees for much of its existence. Yet it has remained absent from ordinary maps. It was intended as a legal and political point of transit, but refugees have been suspended in a prolonged liminal state. 3 generations of people have been born in the camps, all subject to legal restrictions on education, work, mobility, and migration. People who sought refuge in Dadaab have remained almost entirely dependent upon aid, and trade in humanitarian food and non-food items have become integral to the local economy. Human rights abuses have been recorded almost from the establishment of humanitarian operations. Inequalities between refugees, the neighboring host community, and international aid providers have unfolded under the rule and surveillance of the security state. These shelter prototypes that you see on the screen were designed and built after the rains in 2006, which displaced many of the people who lived in Ifo. They became doubly displaced as the roofs of their shelters blew away and parts of the camp flooded, especially those self-settled by refugees arriving in 1991. Those dwellings occupied ground that had become a basin, whose soil had been mined by women making the walls of shelters, and whose slopes were denuded from several years of refugee mothers clearing vegetation and gathering it for cooking fuel. Being compelled to live within strictly guarded confines, the people who lived in Ifo extracted what they could from the surrounding ecology. Yet the slow pressure of this disaster of curtailed biodiversity assumes another tenor entirely when we understand that the majority of people living in refugee camps in Dadaab, and indeed everywhere in the international system, actually, across the world, are women and children. The shelters in the photo here inhabit competing narratives, as it were. On the one hand, they are part of an international humanitarian international humanitarian initiative to expand a refugee settlement. They speak to a development regime of political economy and rights, the horizon of the nation, and the extension of the extractive capitalist and settler colonial state. On the other, they hold and retain obscured histories of illegitimate spaces, queer shelter, and caring and clandestine lifeways that hold meaning for feminists. After 2006, a plan was developed to expand Ifo Camp to the north to an area that was called Ifo 2. By 2010, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and its humanitarian NGO partners had begun building this settlement that you see for 80,000 inhabitants, intended to contain the growing population of refugees and asylum seekers inhabiting Ifo and the other camps or their peripheries. Plots were established in Ifo 2, and these prototype shelters were constructed as various humanitarian NGOs put forward bids to provide shelters across the new camp. However, the commissioning of Ifo 2 was interrupted due to resistance from the Kenyan national government. At one point, the state refused to grant possession of the land to its international humanitarian partners and eventually stopped construction altogether. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear the motorcycles. Eventually, they stopped construction altogether, letting the new camp sit unpopulated while the dense existing camps overflowed. Leaders voiced concerns over security threats that would be exacerbated by marking a sign of permanence for Somalis on Kenyan soil. The architectural terms of this permanence included a well-ordered site plan, generously defined green space, civil and sanitation infrastructure, schools, police barracks, and rows of tiny mud brick homes with ample perimeter grounds that you see here, which could be used for cultivation or animal husbandry, and whose architectural design and construction quality exceeded that of other housing in the region by far. This impasse between the government and the UNHCR forced a planned settlement to stand empty for over a year, even as 1,000 refugees were arriving daily to Dadaab by March of 2011. During that period, before the camp was officially populated, structures such as these prototype dwellings were unofficially inhabited by women, forming contingent kinships with one another and with police officers, who enabled their clandestine dwelling. According to interviews I conducted during my research in Dadaab, the income generation and housing stability enabled by the transactional sexual labor of these secret families informed the domestic fabric of the interim camp. Even if this cloistered social life in the liminal camp was ultimately ephemeral, IFO2 was fully commissioned and opened to refugees in 2012. It constituted a not insignificant element of the material architecture of what, at that time, was the world's largest designated refugee camp. This is to say that this domesticity was making a very, very, very large settlement. It constituted quotidian intimacies in displacement. Over and above direct oppression and sexual coercion, those intimacies contributed to many forms of slow violence. But the friendships between women and the collaborative domesticities also generated complex, emancipatory forms of homemaking. How do we understand a homemaking of coercion and collaboration? How do we think with the paradoxes of insurgent domesticities? I've used my own research to provide an illustration, but could turn to that of any member of this working group to do the same. The project of Insurgent Domesticities indexes and reveals inequalities and injustices cohering social, cultural, and political aspects of domesticity. It draws on practices that emerge from and constitute radical interiority and fraught intimacy, which transform the figurations, materiality, and narrations of home and of domesticity. Members of this working group think through disobedient and dissident domesticities of laundry, gardens, cats, kitchens, the home office, the migrant camp, the kindergarten, the settlement, the housing block, the border wall, the reserve, or the reservation. In our histories, we center the active construction of home through occupancy, the making of new territories by transgressing boundaries, and the transcending or transforming of oppressive domestic structures. As the illustration of IFO2 hangs in your minds, let us think from the clothesline to the state line, of solidarity, disobedience, stealth, and militancy, and with a feminist scholarly politics. What stories do we tell and what stories do we omit? Not all narratives have victims and villains. How do we narrate moral complexity and historical ambiguity? In the preface to Differencing the Canon, Griselda Pollock writes that, quote, "The conscious awareness of narrative when we write history has special resonances for feminists in their desire not only to do history differently, but to tell tales in such a way as to make a difference in the totality of the spaces we call knowledge." I'd like to argue that this narration has as much to do with theory as with analysis, as much with methods as with findings, as much with process as with production. This lifting up of theory, method, and process is intended to be liberatory, and not only to liberate us from the disciplines of scholarly work, but also from ideological frames that deploy the concept of domesticity to organize, limit, or subjugate life, time, people, and places, whether the non-male figure or the non-capitalistic landscape. Within the present worldwide protectionist climate, home is still a fiercely pursued, maintained, and guarded space. Domesticity is involved in the production of identity, security, comfort, and belonging, as well as strategies necessary to maintain the status quo. But domesticity in this way serves as a double-edged tool. It can take on different guises, it can be confining, or it can be emancipatory. It can safeguard or critique notions of family and nation, migration and home. To combat the pliancy of this shape-shifting, we propose the fundamental understanding that domesticity is a politicized field of many interdependencies, from the socio-spatial to the material and the aesthetic, which demand regular negotiation and theorization. Again, based on this understanding that domesticity as a theoretical framework is not static, I'd like to pause for a moment on the act of negotiation through the act of collaboration. Dissident domesticities bound up in questions of governance, global economies, geopolitical borders, war, labor, and ecological crisis call for emancipating, subversive, and collaborative research approaches that straddle or sit between territories, institutions, states, and national space. I hope that joining scholars across differences and divides, institutional divides, nation-state divides, and many other kinds of divides, begins to offer possibilities for solidarities to transcend individuation, to mark difference, but also develop interdependencies, as Audre Lorde famously wrote. And again, I speak these words at the beginning of what I hope will become a collaboration, and it hasn't happened yet, but I write out of hope. To carry out such liberatory historiographical approaches requires multiple forms of scholarly caregiving. Caregiving is another aspect of work and can deeply inform scholarship. Several studies have already shown that the level of scholarly production by women, the demographic least likely to benefit from domestic infrastructure and networks of care, has severely plummeted since the beginning of the pandemic, and that the presence of women overall composing the remunerated labor force has radically decreased. This working group is dedicated to mutual aid and scholarly caregiving. At this early stage, we are yet to fully articulate the forms this might take, and this is a subject I hope to discuss with you in your capacity as practitioners, activists, and collaborators. Is it enough to read together, to read each other's work attentively, to attend to each other's scholarly needs as caretakers? How does that happen? How does that happen during a pandemic? Annapurna Garimella talks about care as a way of doing scholarship. If caring is aligned with domesticity, then one way to study it is to see how people change when they make things, and how making things makes people. How most crafted objects were and are made at home through combined manual and intellectual labor. M. Constantine asks how we might work and relate to one another inside and outside of our academic identities, how to collectively read and write together with care. Melanie Yazzie names intimacies, especially the oppressive intimacies of colonialism, that the United States has engaged to produce domestic dependencies and fulfill imperialist logics through settler practices. Through genealogies of indigenous sovereignty, domestic resistance, international and foreign relations, climate justice, gender politics, and caretaking economies, we might learn and profit from insurgency and counterinsurgency as concepts and methods. Barbara Penner names the intimacies of the body, how thinking outward from embodiment, and particularly the non-conforming body, enables aesthetic and historical precision to understand materials, space, scale, time, and labor through the everyday worlds immediate to the body, for example, of the kitchen and the toilet, but also to the greater infrastructures to which they extend. Akira Drake Rodriguez orients us in the other direction to see how interiors are constructed to create more just exteriors. Following Ella Baker's emphasis on a grassroots approach over charismatic leadership, to understand the fictions of state archives as they reflect on the Great Migration, urban renewal, and gentrification in the United States, as well as parallel regimes of spatial control across the world. Sophie Hochhausel speaks of radical interiority in the question of insurgency. What is the location of radical feminist thought through domesticity? How might we take traditional scholarship and read a radical feminist domesticity in women's groups, feminist and queer ways of making solidarity and kinship? Mignon Moore looks in brothels and other gender non-conforming domesticities for hidden histories of care, sexuality, and understandings between Black lesbians and other sexual minorities in a process of profound racialized migration away from the southern United States. Debshri Mukherjee asks how to think home in contexts of forced migration across the Indian Ocean, and how to conceptualize indentured labor as mediated or constituting a mediatic domestic space. Anna Ozaki reconceptualizes ways of being in space, following Catherine McKittrick, Fred Moten, Denise da Silva Ferreira, and Sylvia Winter to recast orientations in the architectural discipline that occlude marginalized yet central spaces where we live. For example, the very ground under our feet. For Miriam Tickton, COVID-19 has enhanced experiments in what she identifies as a feminist commons, which foreground new horizontal forms of sociality predicated on our porousness, and insist that these are the only way to survive, acknowledging that we must fight for the well-being of everyone if we are to be healthy ourselves. Kavita Sivaramakrishnan takes issue with thinking this pandemic as rupture, instead calling this mainstream discourse fantasy. She demands that we find new forms of solidarity that think beyond rupture and fantasy futures to the moment of the present, for the sake of those who are unable to consider a future and must focus on the present. Madiha Tahir calls the question of rupture a tendency to elide questions of empire, transnational identity, and the place of the United States in the world, at a moment when scholars seem to be willing to abandon urgent, ongoing questions in favor of new avenues of sponsored research on pandemics. For example, further marginalizing discourse on the afterlives of the war on terror and other continuations of US empire. Felicity Scott notes that the work of scholars together can be quote-unquote weaponized to confront the ethical and political challenges of the day. Scholarly caregiving can support work that makes those in power uneasy, especially as attempts are underway around the world to aggressively and systematically rewrite and overwrite histories. And it doesn't have to take the usual forms. Pop-up schools and other ad hoc strategies can create ways to think about how research touches down in a historical moment. Gil Hochberg asks us also to think about how we reread histories. What are the politics of citation? What do we teach? What do we not teach? What happens when we teach Audre Lorde against Judith Butler, working from textually different programs, structures, and lineages? How do we relegate the theoretical frames that are deemed legitimate versus the dreamy ones that are more porous? Can we produce an architectural rearrangement of the textual? Sarovar Zaidi demands that we acknowledge incoherence as productive, rather than reproductive, and standing against the heteronormative family structure as a prevailing domestic infrastructure that isolates scholars without support or house help as they find ways to survive. She names the relationship between capitalism and patriarchy, state oppression, and the home classroom as challenges of functioning in this moment with its attendant politics, the very essence of what she calls unhoming. Garnet Oluwach Olunya calls for a broader examination and charting of origins, for example, citing Toni Morrison's A Mercy as a possible shared reading. What is the domesticity of empire, she asks, and how does it play out as materials move across a wide breadth of imperial space in which a form of the domestic plays out? Nefertiti Tariar similarly notates a domestic space that is widely spread out and perhaps specifically not intimate in transnational kinships of global capitalism and migrant self-care. She links domesticity with time, of course made pronounced in an isolating pandemic, with the domestic time and gendered time of home as the negotiating space. Jennifer Wenzel analyzes a fatigue relating to the shriveling of academic life and the potency of the specific opportunity for multi-scalar social thought, from the scale of the clothesline to that of the state, and the infrastructures and ecologies that span that scale and enable new opportunities for care. For Karina Mullins, such care might respond to and inform scholarship on questions of racialization and the security state, constructions of gender, and the relationship of space and architecture to technologies of control and value extraction. Delia Wendell calls the framing of care powerful. She asks, what of the state, and what of the state's lack of care? How does the state effect memory of violence and enact forms of care that seek to erase trauma rather than enable grieving? Rhiannon Stevens similarly finds a vocabulary for bereavement at the household level, particularly in relation to the lack of material wealth. She asks how the household can be studied materially, what an archaeology of gender, politics, and climate change at the household level looks like. Ife Vanable asks what a Black household looks like, especially a Black household in a tall building, where subjectivity and dwelling must also reside. She pushes in various ways against systematized and systematizing forms of futility, in a search for the politics, aesthetics, materiality, and meaning of the making of home. For Lydia Mutuma, questions of domesticity, as opposed to the questions of housing that architects ask, are urgent, especially in looking for the woman in the narrative. She argues in favor of a scholarship of domesticity, but there are ways of analyzing things that only we can do, and if we do not do this work, who will? Lillian Chi asks where meaning resides in scholarship, as we are losing more and more time. How do you ask this question of domesticity? Where do you ask it? We're in a privileged space, a safe space, where we should challenge ourselves in the ways that we know how to do our work. We should use this space to ask the right questions. So I'll end on that note by saying that in asking the right questions and by turning to these scholar sisters and to those mothers and grandmothers who preceded us to borrow an idea on epistemic recuperation from Alice Walker, I would propose that a feminist collaboration must begin with questions of scholarly caregiving and theoretical acts. Specifically, we must act to give love to each other, to our work, give it warmth and sunlight to grow. So I'll end on this, a theory of love. Thank you again, and welcome your thoughts and your questions.
Thank you. Well, if anyone has any questions, please type them in the chat and we can call on you to voice them. But while people write questions, I would just like to thank you for bringing such an interesting and fascinating discussion, especially with the relevance of the word domesticity and the power that it has. That, you know, I'd never really thought of it before. It's something that encapsulates our life today because we spend basically every waking second inside of our homes, but it's a word that has histories of politics and especially when I think of it, where I grew up and the history of colonialism, how domesticity has this very deeply racial and political consideration of like domestic workers and who and how they look like or continue to look like and who they were. And yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. And I wonder, do you know, have you done any research or have, especially about the refugee camps that you were talking about in Kenya, do you know what happened to them during the pandemic? You know, what types of conditions they had, or in just refugee camps over the world? Because, you know, we all live very different domesticities over the pandemic, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, this is, many things are a crisis, but this is a crisis. I think the situation with running water varies in different camps. In the place where where I work, in many of the places where I worked, water distribution was a critical issue, and just being able to have soap is a critical issue. I think I haven't been focusing closely on the pandemic issues in Dadaab, but the environment was already so acute before this that this is only stretching resources that were already very slight.
We have a question from Sanjana. If you want to voice it.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the lecture. I noticed there were quite a few binaries that you set up while you were talking. A couple were like liberation versus subjugation, coercion versus collaboration. And I'm interested in the binary in its capacity to evoke things like heteronormativity and like gender normativity in terms of households, as well as even a current political structure that we're seeing this week. And so I'm curious if or how the binary becomes like a tool for you to further your work and like the setting up and breaking down of binaries.
It's a great question. It's a really great criticism, actually. I think that one of the things that I have been trying to work out myself, and we had many small meetings with members of this group, and one of the conversations that emerged a few times was this question of insurgency and how to think about insurgency at a moment when I suppose what we had conceived of as an insurgent condition around domesticity is no longer insurgent. It's in fact common, and it is. It's the context that everyone is dealing with on some level, as we've all become interiorized due to this very strange event that has united, I suppose, the modern developed planet. And I think that. You asked the question in an interesting way. We had really thought along these lines of structure and resistance, I think, prior to this immersive context that I think we are in now. And I think it was actually a good, a tool for figuration. It was a tool to let us begin to start seeing what this project could be. And I have been really dwelling on this a bit since actually getting the grant to move ahead with this project, which has also been concurrent with the pandemic, because I have myself been really calling into question what an insurgency and what a counterinsurgency really are, and whether in fact that is really useful to think with at this time. I think that academically and purely theoretically, it's still a very useful term. It does set up this kind of structure and resistance narrative that I think is not necessarily the way forward. But I do think it gives us, at the starting point of a project, it gives us theoretical anchor points to just let a conversation begin. So I want to qualify it like that. I think that I'm not ready to give it up just yet because I think it does some work right now. But I've already moved to a place where I see beyond it as a horizon line.
Thank you.
We have another question in the chat from Devashri. Do you want me to read it or do you want to voice it? I don't know if there's...
I think they want you to read it.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll read it. It says, "What a wonderful, loving talk. Thank you all. I am really inspired by the structure of your talk, the way you invoke all the voices of the scholars you are collaborating with. but I also want to ask about your specific embodied and embedded experiences and their relation to your theoretical and methodological interests. Example, as a mother and architect, a situated practitioner of homemaking on so many levels, what are the things you have noticed in the Dadaab camps that might have otherwise eluded you?
Devashri Mukherjee, by the way, is one of our collaborators. So maybe it's a nice question. I think, I've always, I'm always very careful not to describe the work I do as ethnography. I think I was trained in ethnography, but I don't think it is what I did in the work that I did. But I do think that there is a kind of embodied knowledge that I approached these spaces with, for sure. And certainly that I approached the archives of these spaces with, whether those archives were official documentary archives or whether they were, a study of the buildings and the site itself. And I think that without this kind of architectural knowledge, I wouldn't have known to look, for instance, at the buildings, the buildings in the image that I showed in the way that I did. I happened to just be able to look at them and know very intimately how they were constructed, for instance, and know what was typical about them and what was atypical about them, for example. So there's a lot of that kind of knowledge that one brings to bear. I always say I had a 4-year-old child the first time I went to, I spent about 2 or 3 years going to different camps around the world. And the first time I went to a refugee camp was in Ethiopia, and my son was 4 at the time. And I always say that my questions really grew out of being a mother myself. I don't think I would have known what to think or what to ask if I didn't know what it felt like to this kind of desperation that a displaced person with children might feel. I don't talk a lot about this because it's awkward, I guess, but I think that that is an absolutely embodied experience that informs scholarship. It is also what informs my whole concern with scholarly caregiving. Whether or not this gets properly theorized over time and whether we actually figure out how to do it is an open question still, but I think that my own life experiences absolutely inform my commitment to that as a process.
Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, well, it's not fully articulated, but I guess I'll give it a stumble. Within this kind of framing scenario that you set up between rupture and fantasy and those who can't think of the future, who are, kind of forced to think of their present situation, what would a scholarly love and care look like for them? Or how can a scholar directly or indirectly touch people who are forced to only think about the present?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. I think it's one that we all are thinking about lately as we are. I mean, every one of us is sort of dwelling with others in this moment because we all have been subjected to various different kinds of crises. The person who said those words, my colleague Kavita Sivaramakrishnan, I don't know exactly what she was thinking of at the time. One of the things that we've been talking about is this massive migration in India of laborers across the subcontinent. And I'm not even sure that was what she was referring to, but I think there are many, I think of migrants in particular because I think of the temporal frame that people have to deal with when they are connected to a place because of labor, and that they're in a capitalist framework, their labor can be suddenly removed or erased, and thus they are required then to move rather than to be settled. And I think that's a moment where the temporal frame takes over, and one must deal with the present. There isn't a past or future that one can immediately access. There are so many things in the present that have to be dealt with that I suspect that this was some of what she was thinking about. For me, because I've been spending a lot of time thinking about migratory populations and people who are forced to migrate, I've really been focusing on how to write with these people, how to make use of the great privilege of being somewhat landed in order to give a conduit for some of these experiences to have a space to exist in a larger imagination and in a larger temporal frame that extends beyond the present, particularly frames that are allowed to have a history. Because I think the other thing about these very urgent contexts is that they're somehow cut off from history and also cut off from heritage. And so it's been important to me to think about how to expand time and allow an inhabitation of time. But I've tried many different strategies, and maybe I also do this because I like to use a kind of citational practice. I really like to let people's words be their words, even though obviously I'm citing and I'm a conduit and I'm rewriting. I think that I'm still attempting to give credit to the words of others as much as possible. And I do that even with the people who I know won't ever be co-writers in a literal sense. But I think of everyone I have ever interviewed as a co-writer in a conceptual sense.
We have another question from Sanjana, if no one else has any.
Yeah, if anyone else wants to ask something, please go ahead first. Otherwise, I can talk. Yeah, it's also in relation to this idea of caregiving in scholarship. And I think like a lot of the ways that I've encountered this idea of care before has been in relation to or like in resistance towards capitalism's obsession with like newness, whether that's like the newness of architecture, the newness of ideas. And so I'd be interested to know how you situate caregiving in relation to the production of new knowledge, while still resisting those like alternative like newness narratives.
Yeah, it's in process. I don't have a straight answer. I have instincts, and so I've been following them. But I do think it has to do with a kind of special attentiveness. I think that some of what I maybe am also processing is there's been such a negative reaction to the concepts of care. My colleague Delia Wendell, my colleague Miriam Tickton, they've all written on these ways in which care is in fact threatening and is in fact a control mechanism. And I think that those are really important theorizations. And I find us in this kind of COVID moment, I hear a lot of people rethinking care, including those two authors, through practices of mutual aid and emphasizing the ways in which we care for each other and we care for ourselves. And I think there's something in that agency that I've been trying to grapple with and work out. And so I guess I fundamentally have been trying to think through care as a way in which scholars can express a kind of agency around their own work and also others' work, and to have a sense of mutual aid, but also a sense of mutual power, that you have a kind of power to nurture something, that you don't have to wait for it to be nurtured, or you don't have to wait for it to be anointed somehow, but that you can grow something just through, your own willpower. I don't know if I know the exact mechanics of how this would work. I believe that there's a sense of attentiveness that goes with it. And I believe that there's a sense of collective attention that is important. But I think these are some of the things I would like us to work on. I also really do think that you can tell a well-loved work. And you can tell when a work has not grown through a kind of scholarly love. You can tell when something is sort of stripped of that kind of attentiveness. And so again, I'm speaking through instinct rather than through well-articulated theory. But I have a sense that if you love scholarship in the right way, when it is nascent, it can grow into something really well formed and well theorized. But I do think that it's a group project. I don't think it's something that, it maybe to think again on this problem of the binary. I don't think it's something that is unidirectional, and I don't think it's something that happens, for instance, between a mentor and a student. Exactly. I think it's something that a group can do, and it's a little of a kind of grassroots approach. I hope that gets at it. It's not fully formed in my mind, and I think some of why it's not is that I'm waiting for the dialogue to happen around this, and it's in a pre-dialogical moment. But I am opening it up to all of you too, because you are also part of this dialogue, and I would be very interested to hear, if you were interested in that concept, how you think it happens, because you all have to do collaborating as well. So you have a little bit of experience in this area.
If I could add to something I was thinking of while you were just answering this question. Hi. I was thinking about how you even present the work as not just yours, but as a collective since the beginning, and that already sort of undermines this idea of ownership of scholarship, or using scholarship as capital gain in that sense, just by not claiming complete ownership or even, I think, control over everything that you present. And that sort of forms the basis for this collective practice of caregiving, in my mind, that you're talking about.
Yeah, it creates vulnerabilities, and even presenting an idea before it is formed it creates vulnerabilities, but I think that there's something to the act of putting something, that is vulnerable out into the world. That can be a powerful thing. I suppose it has to be done in a certain way. And that is where I think a collective approach, a collective and caring approach means something. I think on a very practical level too, we're taught to work against each other, and certainly women in this society are not encouraged to work with each other. And I think I'm just resistant to that a bit. I really want to see if there's another way. I, like Joe Biden, am a socialist.
In a way, this also reminded me of some of the last points we touched with Michelle Wright, where we talked about kind of when these divergent specificities are difficult to collectivize, or when people's specific lives and the way that they go about their lives and kind of exercise their agency, how they're hard to collectivize. In a way, what I'm getting from this conversation is the importance of vulnerability to sustain a collective effort and an insurrection whether it's academic or even in terms of care, to be able to put something together. That we need to learn how to be vulnerable and sustain knowledge in that way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that's getting at it. I think I'm not entirely comfortable with the concept of vulnerability, because I don't think it's just about being vulnerable, because I do think there's a kind of power around it. I think it's a very conditioned vulnerability that one can use as a method. But I think it combats this kind of toxicity around power, the idea that power has to somehow be oppressive. I think power can be many different kinds of things, and it absolutely doesn't have to be oppressive, and it doesn't have to subjugate. But I think that there's a life force in just a sort of early piece of scholarly work in which where the scholarship is really raw, and yet it's put out into a forum in a way that is vulnerable, in a way that it is just not fully formed, I guess. And I think there's something very powerful about that, because what it does is that it does create these anchors for others to come in and have a way to be part of making it, because it isn't fully made yet. That, I think, is something that we need to actually gain some precision on. That's where I do think that people who work in like spatial and aesthetic practice think about this a lot. I don't know whether they verbally articulate it or not is another question, but they absolutely think with this way of this method of working. And I think that that it's something fundamental about collaboration that gets at some of these feminist problematics that have to do with how power works and how relationships work and how you can, you can advance and recede and allow for something to grow, not necessarily through a kind of vertical means with a foundation and something growing vertically from it, but something that just sort of moves back and forth, that isn't necessarily linear. Something that's kind of porous and allows many different voices to come in and play a part in it. It's a bit, I mean, we're speaking a bit abstractly, but I think I'm talking very concretely about just how you make a project, how you, even how you conceptualize something theoretical, or how you write a book, or how you, make a building, or whatever the project is, I think that the only ways that multiple people can come into it is if there's a sort of vulnerability at play. There has to be something that can still be molded. Mm-hmm. So I have appreciated the opportunity to put thoughts on the table without wanting them to be fully formed yet. Because I think, and I also think that that's antithetical to most of our capitalist academic practices. We are really called upon to make things that are perfect, to show things only when they are finished, to be, somehow the owners of the thing, that like to treat our ideas like property. I think that that's what I wanted to sort of write against and speak against. But again, some of the language that I'm using even tonight, they're even thinking with the concept of against, isn't necessarily where I'm headed with this, because I again don't think that I don't think what I'm after is something that is simply around resistance or even around insurgency. But yet that's where it is right now.
But I think
yeah, I think do you have a question?
I think I do. So I think I have a question, and thank you, Professor Siddiqi. It's so nice to have you back at Cooper.
Nice to see you.
Yeah. So I think where my question lies, and I come in and out of recognizing that you're addressing it, and then maybe stepping back from it, but coming forward and stepping back, which I love, in terms of how you speak, and that is how much you are really believe that to change this process of making scholarship, to really have a new way of practicing how we work together, how critical is the theorization of that to its successful to its successful launching, perhaps? Because as someone who is not a historian and is not a theorist, but is much more deeply rooted in practice, can we not just practice it and practice practicing it, while in order to, and then let the theory come later? Or, is there one that kind of requires the other? And, kind of how much your group has thought about that?
Yeah, I think that's a nice question. And I mean, again, the group hasn't really launched yet, so I can't say that the group has thought about it. But certainly in some of these preliminary conversations, some responses have come up to what you're saying. Specifically, I'm thinking of something that Sarover Zaidi said. I mean, she was really adamant that, and she is in general in her work, that that incoherence, in a sense, be valued. That you don't have to have a fully written theory for everything. And yet, I do think that there's, I was really struck by something that Felicity Scott said, which was, she made a pretty strong argument for fine scholarship, and that an outcome of this could be fine scholarship. And I think that I find that in a way, it doesn't matter what you do as long as you do it well. It could be that I think this way because I myself am also trained as an architect. I'm trained as a maker. So somewhere in I was trained also as a writer before that, but somewhere in my DNA is this idea that actually, it's a very artful idea that in the end, it doesn't matter what the form is as long as it works, or it doesn't matter, what the idea is as long as it's beautiful and that you've kind of transmitted that beauty somehow. So I do think that there's that way of thinking that you somehow make something that really works, and then it works. So that if what that thing is practice, or is a kind of daily habit or a daily practice, maybe that's what it is. Mm-hmm. But my sense is that because we're a group of scholars, what we will be doing ultimately is something scholarly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I think we should aspire to, I suppose. This is a group of people whose work in different ways aligns with this conceptualization of insurgent domesticities. My sense is that these are all people who would, even if they only worked on their own work and never really did come together in a collaborative form, their work intersects with the themes enough that we could teach each other and learn. So it could be that all we do in the end is what you're describing, is have a practice together. At least we have people to sit next to while we are practicing, or something like that. And that could also be perceived as, a positive or a successful outcome, if not that you use those words, but if we were to use such words. But I think, we could potentially also aspire to making something together, I think. Mm-hmm. It's funny to talk about a collaboration that hasn't happened yet. Yeah. It's a bit like an artist or an architect talking about their practice, like about how they work when they haven't even worked yet. They haven't built the thing yet. It's a very odd thing to do when you're talking about scholarship, because you usually talk about it in the past tense, the book you wrote.
Right.
But I think that also, honestly, this is also a moment, we are all somewhat interiorized and needing to think about how we're going to work next, what we're going to do when we come out of these bunkers, and how we're going to be. And whether we're thinking about like ourselves as citizens in the political world that we're in, or whether we're thinking of ourselves as, workers and what we do with our work. I feel it's important to articulate aspirations. We're in a moment when articulating aspirations is also important.
Agreed. And that share, and certainly being part of a school to teach each other languages, new languages, to speak about how we do what we do so that we can do what we do differently, because we finally have the language to describe those different conditions, I think is really important moving forward.
Yeah, I think about all these architecture students, everywhere, who wrote these manifestos over the summer, and whether or not they amount to actual change in their actual institution, I do think that there's some value. It gave us all language. It really did. And it was and I keep coming back to this, but it was the multiplicity of these things, that there wasn't just one new language, there were so many. Mm-hmm. That something about that collectivity, it wasn't a direct collective, but there was a collection of these different manifestos in these different places that I think it just together created a different kind of forum. So, it was a form of scholarly caregiving in a sense. Maybe unintentional, but it did create new languages of care. How might we care for the Black student in an architecture school? Or the Black professor? I think these were things that taught us all a lot. I mean, just gave us new ways to see and to think. But that is also what I am really kind of committed to is, I don't know if it will work, because honestly, like every lesson I've gotten from the academy is that anytime you try to do something collaboratively, you're just screwed. You will personally be punished for attempting it. But I also think, I just think it's possible.
Yeah, I agree. I think you just need to demand change at the next level up. If the next level up says you're gonna have to pay for this, then you say, okay, then we need to change up another level. But yeah, I think we're all at a point where something's got to give, and so the more thoughts, the more voices, the more languages, and I guess perhaps the more theories that one brings into the conversation about what parts of the structure, are really not working for anyone anymore, and what parts of the structure have served us well, and so are worth carrying forward. I think we are generally in that time.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, especially in a time of so much isolation, it's very heartwarming to hear about collaboration and the importance of really connecting with each other through ideas and experiences, and especially when it comes to academics. The summer really taught us that to get the way we're going to get through this, or at least change your pedagogy into something that really reflects the people that are studying it, and is through combining our experiences and our opinions together. So thank you for this. It's an extremely weird week, and a lot of uncertainty. And so I think you were exactly the medicine that we needed for our very, or at least mine, but my very unstable mind this Thursday night. If no one has any other questions, I think this is a wonderful spot to end on.
Well, the feeling is mutual, Martina.
Yeah.
I think we've all been through a lot together, so it's nice to be with you all and go through some more things together. And we somehow spent 90 minutes without checking the ticker.
Yeah, but I still want to ask, does anybody know anything yet?
Well, not yet. I mean, Georgia's about to be decided, so we'll see what happens. But yeah, thank you so much for coming, and hopefully by the time this lecture is online, we'll live in a much better world if everything goes our way. And have a really pleasant Thursday night. Take care and
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Anooradha. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care of yourselves.